In this video we're going to create our particle shooting mob, which we'll call shooter mob, and he's going to have the ability to shoot a particle system, which is basically the projectile from his shooting area at the player, which he'll actually be very accurate at shooting as well. So to get started, now that we have a lot of our classes our structure being built pretty well, we have our foundation for our game starting to come to form. It doesn't take a lot for us now to add things. So in other words, for instance, now that we have our enemy information classes, and we're starting to set certain things to make each character a little different. This won't take too much for us to create another creature. So what we do is we go into our class, we create a class called Puz Enemy Information underscore Shooter Mob, and that extends from Puz Enemy Information. And then in our default properties, we set where it's located and the things that are associated with it inside of our content pack. So it's class content.atom set shooter mob, and we have the physics asset, the skeletal mesh, and the atom tree. We set our collision radius and height, and our pawn scale, normal speed, and our beacon pickup. Now, once again, with collision radius and height, it takes some tweaking. I just pretty much grabbed what we had from the other creature, though it probably will need some tweaking in order to make it fit properly with the game. Starting inventory would be, we're going to call the weapon, we're going to give this creature a blaster. So it'll be a puzzlegame.puzzweapon underscore blaster. And of course, since we're giving it a weapon, we need to set the B has starting inventory to true. Now that we have our creature created, we need to give it an ability to start somewhere, so we create a start point for it. And we pretty much, in a way of speaking, we can almost copy exactly what we had from the other start point, paste it, and then just change the skeletal mesh and the AI type. So we change the skeletal mesh to class content.skeletalmesh.shootermob. Obviously, the class name changes as well. It's called Puz Enemy Start Point underscore Shooter Mob, and our AI type is Shooter Mob. Now, one thing you'll have to remember though is whenever you have a new start point and you set an AI type of a different version, you need to make sure that you also associate it with our controller. So we go inside of our Puz AI controller into initialize, where we set the AI type and our switch statement for the AI type, and we just want to add another switch option. So we just throw in another case, like we have case melee mob, this time we have case shooter mob, and we point that start point, now we connect it to the correct information. So if it is a shooter mob start point, we want to use the shooter mob enemy information class. Now that we have that done, we need to create the weapon for the shooter mob. As we mentioned earlier, the weapon's called a puzzweapon underscore blaster. So we're going to go under and create another class called puzzweapon underscore blaster, which extends from puzzweapon. Now, because this is a projectile, it's going to be a little different than our melee weapon. We're going to be overloading the projectile fire function to make sure that it spawns the class the way we want it to and uses it the way we want it to. Down in default properties, we're going to set the fire type to a EWFT underscore projectile, which is, these are things that are already created for us. We just need to make sure we tell it is a projectile weapon. And we set the projectile to what's known as a Puz projectile underscore blast, which is another class we'll be creating in a second. We're going to set our fire interval to 3, so we're going to make him shoot pretty much like once every 3 seconds. It's really not a time between shooting, it's actually the time that takes place for him to actually shoot it. So like, it's kind of almost like building up the ability to shoot, so to speak. Alright, so now that we have, so let's go back up to our projectile fire real quick before I run away from this class here. In here we're going to create a couple things. We're going to create a couple vectors and rotators, and we also have a class version of projectile, which is called projectile class, and we have a projectile instance, which is called projectile spawn. Now, what we're going to do then is we're going to get the world location and rotation of this socket, the weapon socket that we use. This is important so that we can, when we shoot the projectile from it, that it actually has the proper coordinates. We don't want it to shoot out the back or the front or things like that. We want to make sure it gets the proper world location for that. Now this is a lot like the trace, where it uses like an out variable. So we pass these in and it gets set inside of the function for us. We don't actually have to set these individually, kind of like I said, like kind of like referencing the variable. So we pass in the WebSocket location and a WebSocket rotation, which are two of the local variables that we created here. And then we go down here and we set the projectile class to equal get projectile class function, or the parentheses there, which basically is a function. And what this function does is it has the ability to look these up down here, these weapon projectiles that we set, and then it passes them in to the projectile class so that we know which projectile class is being fired. If the projectile class is not equal to none, so if there is an actual projectile class, which there is, we're going to projectile spawn is going to equal to the spawned class, and we're going to pass in those projectile locations and rotations that we set here, the weapon location and of course the rotation of the pawn, because when the pawn rotates, so does the socket, so it's not really necessary for us to worry about that, the socket rotation, so to speak. So then we go inside of if project spawn is not equal to none, so if the projectile spawn does not equal to none, so if we did spawn something, then we're going to initialize it, and then we're just going to return projectile spawned. And that's going to pretty much finish up this function. This gets called when there's a fire taking place, whenever start fire is called. And the reason why this gets called instead of, for instance, an instant hit function is because we set down here in the fire types that it's a projectile. So that's why it points to this now. And that's kind of the neat thing that UDK offers, is a lot of this code has been done for us. We don't have to rebuild anything. We just have to kind of modify it to make it work the way we want it to. So now that we have our weapon created, we need to be able to tell it what a puz projectile underscore blast is. Well, before we want to do that, we want to create our base class for our projectiles, which we will call puz projectile, and that extends from UDK projectile. In here we have two variables. We have a particle system variable, which we call projectile firing particle, or PROJ firing particle, and we also have a variable called particle system component, which is projectile system component. And what we do first is inside of simulated function post begin play, we call a function called setup projectile spawning. Post begin play will be called every single time the creature shoots, because this does not exist yet. It hasn't been spawned. It gets spawned inside of projectile fire. Once it's spawned, then this is where this functionality kicks in. In order for us to grab this functionality, we need to tell it to. So when it gets spawned, it goes through its normal initial running, and then it hits post begin play, and then it hits setup projectile spawning. So we go down in here, and inside of setup projectile spawning, we make sure that there is a projectile firing particle. Projectile firing particles there. Now, you might say, well, we haven't set projectile firing particle. Well, that's because we set that inside of our puz projectile blast. For each separate projectile, we set our own projectile firing particle. So it has been set, but we just haven't gotten to it yet. So for right now, we're going to assume that it is not equal to none. It does equal something. So then what we do is we're going to set our projectile system component to equal basically this projectile, this firing projectile. And the way we do that is we grab it from the emitter pool. Whenever you spawn something that's kind of independent from the owning actor, that's like an effect of some sort, like a particle system, it normally ends up in the emitter pool under world info, which kind of holds all this information for us. So and that's pretty much what we're doing. So we're basically spawning that projectile system component for us to use now. And add its own like viewing of the world, because really at this point this is just a class. It doesn't mean anything. So we're actually going to be spawning it. So first we kind of spawn the projectile, which is just this emptiness, so to speak. We spawn it inside the blaster. Now it's not like empty. It does exist as an actor in the game. It just has no physical representation yet. It's kind of like a pawn without its skeletal mesh. So now we need to create sort of that skeletal mesh for this particle system. And in order for us to do that, we use a particle system component. So when this thing spawns, we go into we call on to spawn emitter custom lifetime in order to spawn a custom lifetime to this particle, and we pass in the projectile firing particle, which sets this component now. So now what we can do is we can use this component, and as you can see here, we eventually attach this component to this projectile so that we have some sort of physical viewing of it. If we never did this, you would never see the projectile, but it would exist. It just you wouldn't see it. The set absolute has to deal with I believe it deals with the world coordinates in the game. So by setting these to false, it makes sure that it acts properly to its world coordinates. And then the on system finish is a delegate. So we create our own version of this function because delegates, what a delegate is it's kind of like a template function, so to speak, where what you can do is you can kind of create your own version of it, of this template function, but it always gets called on from the same at the same time. So on system finished is called on already inside the code. We don't have to tell it to call it. It'll be called when it's supposed to be called. We just need to make our own version of this on system finished delegate. So we call that particle system finished. And then we have attached component, which we attach the component. You should already kind of have an idea what that means at this point. We're basically putting this component onto this projectile, so there will be a physical viewing of it. In the initialize, which gets called earlier inside of the Puzz Weapon Blaster right here, initialize, that just pretty much sets our velocity, which is the speed times the direction, and our acceleration, which is the acceleration times velocity. So, and then of course we also set a rotation there. So this is just to deal with the speed of the projectile and things like that. And we set all that, the speed, direction, acceleration rate, well not direction, but speed, acceleration rate. We kind of set those things inside of our default properties for each separate projectile. We'll get to that in a second as well. Down here we have our particle system finished, which is the delegate that we create our own version of. And when we use a delegate, it needs to pass kind of the same things in, because it's pretty much the same it's the same function being called. It's just we need to, so you can't just switch things around. You need to keep it the same. So you can change the name, but you keep pretty much everything else the same when it comes to the actual function. And then inside you can kind of change it to what you need. And obviously it passes in the particle system component. We want to make sure the particle system component does equal the projectile system component inside that we used before. And then up at the top here, we make sure that those two do equal. So we are using, that we are basically using the same particle system that we're supposed to be using. And then what happens is when this gets called, it's because the particle system has kind of run its course and it should be shut down. So what we're going to do is we're going to detach the component, and we're going to tell the world, the world info emitter pool basically that the particle system is finished as well. And then we're going to set the projectile system component to none. Down here in destroyed, this is kind of like this in a way. It does the exact same thing. The only difference is destroyed usually happens if it hits something, and we want to detach the component as well. Tell the emitter pool once again that this system's finished, etc., etc. And that pretty much does it for the projectile. Now we're going to go into our version of the projectile. So we have class Puzz projectile underscore blast extends Puzz projectile. And in our default properties, we set our projectile firing particle here, like I mentioned before, and that's set to whatever projectile system we created in our UDK editor. So that's class content particle systems.blast particle. We set our speed, max speed, and acceleration rate here, so how fast it's going to go. What amount of damage, if there's a damage radius, so if there's an explosion, for instance. We didn't tell it to have an explosion back in the weapon area, so even if we put a damage radius, it might not even work, because we didn't really tell it to damage in a radius type thing if there was an explosion. And then we have momentum transfer. My damage type, of course, we haven't gotten the damage types yet, but and then we have lifespan 3.0, which basically is the lifespan of the projectile, how long it will live. We want to collide with the world, and of course, we set the draw scale to 1, but if you wanted to make this bigger, you can make it bigger, set it to 2. If you want to make it smaller, you can make it smaller. It's up to you. And that pretty much is all we need to do. Now, because we created our Puzz projectile, now next time we make a projectile weapons, we don't need to create this again. We can pretty much spawn go off of this. And we can also, if you wanted to, you could further create new things inside the projectiles, make them more fun or different. But for right now, this is what we need to get started, so that from here we can easily add on and add on and add on. So now if you start, you want to probably use test level 4. And when you start, you should be able to see this new mob, and he will shoot at you when he finally sees you.